fell into place. The Prime Minister did a fantastic job. His representatives are total professionals, and they got along well, and it just seemed to work. And I think one of the reasons it did is because we blew up the whole system. If we would have just been dealing with you separately, or country by country, we blew up the whole system. It was very fair to the very unfair to the United States. And I think because of that, this worked out so nicely. And I'm honored that it was the first deal.
U.S. President Donald Trump there announcing a trade deal to reduce some tariffs on the United Kingdom. An agreement reached more than 2 months after British Prime Minister Keir Starmer sat down with Trump at the White House. Prime Minister Mark Carney, meanwhile, got a warm reception in the Oval Office Tuesday, but no public or substantive movement on Trump's trade war or 51st state obsession. The Prime Minister is bringing back the House of Commons at the end of this month, but he's coming back 3 seats short of a majority, meaning he'll need to work with the opposition on any legislated response to Trump's trade war. With us now on how that may play out is former Conservative Party leader Erin O'Toole. He's now the president of AIDIT North America and a distinguished fellow at the Hudson Institute. AIDIT or ADIT? I'm sorry.
ADIT,
my apologies. I knew I would mess that up. Thank you very much, Mr. O'Toole, for joining us. I appreciate you making the time. And I did want to start off on the question of Trump in really sort of what Canadians are expecting of their politicians at this point in time. You wrote a Substack. You have a Substack on it this week, and I read it with great interest. Do you think they expect something differently of politicians than they might have even 6 months ago?
I think they do, and that was the point of my essay on Substack, was the country is greater than any political party, and all politicians will have to realize they have to put the best interests of the country first. And so I've been saying everyone should be cheering for Prime Minister Carney, hoping that he can have success. I think he had a very successful first meeting with the president, because that relationship is so fundamental to Canada. It's our most important trade relationship. It's our singularly most important defense and security relationship. And it's been horrific to see how unfairly we've been treated, how we've been disrespected by the president. It's shocking to Canadians. So we want the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, to do well. And I've seen my Conservative colleagues say the same thing. So I think if that's coming out of an election that was hardly fought hardly, people talking like that, that's a very good sign for the country.
As someone who understands the nature of partisan politics very well, who led a political party, is it, do you think, going to be difficult to sustain that? And what would your best advice be to try and do so?
I think right now that Prime Minister Carney has done 2 things that I think are critical. Had a very important meeting with Premier Smith before that meeting with President Trump, making sure we have as much alignment, particularly because of the differences between energy in the West and manufacturing, like the auto industry in Ontario. So that was key. I also like the fact that he said straight up, I'm not going to play games on Mr. Poilievre getting into the House. Kudos to Damien Couric, a good friend, for making a tough decision to step away, but an important one to let his leader get into the House. The fact that the Prime Minister could rag the puck for 6 months, and I know Prime Minister Carney likes hockey analogies, so ragging the puck would not have been good for national unity. We need to see our democracy function. Pierre needs to get in the House. But I think on the U.S. trade relationship, the Conservatives, I'd certainly like them to see them put the country first and wish the Prime Minister well.
Substantively, where do you think there are possibilities for the Conservatives to support the federal government? Like, where, and I'm not saying the federal government has said they're going to pursue it explicitly, but like, where do you see opportunity for what you're describing to actually take place? Well,
there's 2 key areas, Vashi. The first is energy. You know, I was in Prime Minister Harper's cabinet. You know, Prime Minister Harper used to say Canada's an energy superpower. I heard Mr. Carney use that term. It shocked a lot of people. But that's the first ground where there could be a lot of common cause. And most of the trade surplus that we have, Mr. Trump views it as losing to Canada. No, he's winning because he's getting our energy at a discount. And so Canadian resources, from oil and gas to uranium to potash, it's energy security, food security. The other thing there's common cause is both leaders talked about the Arctic and doing more on defense, and particularly in the Northwest Passage. We could propose joint work in the Northwest Passage with the United States much like we do in the St. Lawrence Seaway. There doesn't seem to be much distance between the two parties on that. The Americans have been asking for us to do more on defense, going back to President Obama said it when he was in the House of Commons. So I think those are two areas right off the top that not only have some alignment between what Pierre was saying and what Prime Minister Carney is saying, but also what the Americans want to see from us as a more reliable, more dependable ally.
Can you do that? Can you support those measures and also maintain your identity as not, a party, but also a party that opposes the government and ultimately wants to topple them at some point?
I think so. And, Pierre will have to, assemble a bit of a new team, take a bit of a fresh approach, because the reality, Vashi, is we've been advocating on those things for many, many, many years. I used to talk about the Arctic incessantly as an MP. Canadians are now ready to listen. You see the social license. Canadians, Quebecers interested in possibly supporting a pipeline. That was just not the case 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. It's changing. So the Conservatives were actually ahead of the curve on a lot of these issues, but the country wasn't quite ready for those nation-building projects. The country is now. I see that. I live in Toronto now, work across the country. There's support for more Canadian self-assuredness, more self-reliance, and they now understand that energy is a huge asset for us. I think it'll be key to getting the Americans back to the table. So I think Prime Minister Carney knows this. He also knows the strong support for the resource sector the Conservatives have. So, the Conservatives can say, hey, we've been pushing this for years, and then really make the case that we're a government in waiting and we deserve your trust in the future.
When you talk about the U.S. coming back to the table, I'm wondering what you think the end goal for Canada is, and ultimately, what our objective in any kind of negotiations. I don't even know necessarily what form they're taking, but we've just literally, had a deal with a partner that contravened it on multiple occasions. How will that inform and impact whatever comes next, and how do we, I guess, define what we want out of it when we know that's a reality?
The only certainty right now is uncertainty with President Trump, but he seems, as the UK deal shows us today, he seems to be interested in quick bilateral deals. And so we do have USMCA. If it's not being respected, and if it could be fully renegotiated in a year, perhaps we can get a deal where he basically respects those tenets, reduces tariffs on auto and steel and aluminum. And I've often said energy security and the Prime Minister or the President's desire to rebuild the American shipbuilding industry, to rebuild their national defense capability, they need our aluminum. They need our steel and our supply chains for defense just as much as they do for auto. So I think the meeting Prime Minister Carney had was good because it seemed to establish a reset of tone. And there will still be, the odd taunt on Truth Social. We can't lose sight of the big picture, which is reestablishing smart dialogue and then using our natural assets like resources, like energy, like decarbonizing the electricity grid. Only Canada shares defense with the U.S. Only Canada shares the electricity grid with the U.S. We're not like the U.K. or France or other countries. So let's leverage that and get as much of a bilateral deal as we can to give manufacturers and employers some certainty.
Do you think that Donald Trump was the ballot box question in this federal election?
I think he was a big part of it. The Liberals did something I was mesmerized by. Really, they had a cabinet shuffle of really just one important minister, the first minister, the prime minister. Everyone else is the same. So, the people that were defending the carbon tax are now silent and in the cabinet. Same with the capital gains, all this sort of stuff. I think people were surprised by the tone of Trump this time, the governor of the 51st state, but they were also surprised that the Liberals not only changed Mr. Trudeau, but in 10 days, Mr. Carney basically jettisoned several of the key pillars of Mr. Trudeau's time. And he also went to Paris and the UK very quickly to show that, hey, we have other friends. I think Canadians like that. I thought that was very smart to do, to show the Americans we have a lot of friends, including two countries that were part of our founding. We're going to survive. We're going to stand up. But I've said we need to have elbows up, but we also need to smarten up because we have to spend more in defense. A number of things that we should have been doing. I think Mr. Carney has pivoted the Liberal Party in a way that surprised people. So I think those two factors made for a challenging election for us.
Do you think it surprised your party? Do you think it surprised Mr. Poilievre and his team?
Well, I think, you know, the one thing that they got used to having strong poll numbers, and I think a lot of people thought that Mr. Trudeau was going to stay, and then it was going to be a referendum election, you know, throw the bums out type election, which is often how we see change in Canada. This was radically changed in late fall, early in this new year, and I think Pierre did adapt to it, but I think not to the extent we needed to, and so that'll be part of the learnings they have. There's a lot of great new things, a lot of new seats. We're going to see some new MPs. Areas like Windsor in Ontario, we're not used to seeing a lot of Conservatives come out of that part of the province. So there's a lot of wins in a loss that was also disappointing. I also know how much Pierre and his family have put into it. My family did that. I have so much respect for anyone that does. But they also have to learn some of these lessons, because we could see a two-party system in Canada for the next few years at least while the NDP is rebuilding. That will help Mr. Carney sort of have a functioning majority if the NDP is rebuilding and need to lend him their support. So the Conservatives need to take note of successes and what worked, but also take note of what we have to do to win in a two-horse race.
I guess just a final question on that change, because I read, again, you sort of talked about it in your Substack, and you've mentioned tonight the idea of tone. Do you think there needs to be a change in tone in the leader, for example, particularly when it comes to dealing with people like Doug Ford or Tim Houston? And I would point to I think it was during the campaign, or maybe just before, the campaign manager, you know, you had said something nice about Anita Anand when she announced she was leaving, and she called you out on Twitter, and that sort of, I guess, had a lot of people talking about the tone that was being employed. It was emblematic, I think, of what some have criticized the party for. Do you share in that criticism? You know, I don't know if you've responded to that call out, but
well,
I would like to know.
Anita didn't leave, you know. So
she came back,
I think she owes me lunch or something after that. Look, I got started in politics, and I said this in my Blue Stack Substack. Please subscribe. Yeah. I started as a PC in Ontario and then in Nova Scotia. So Doug Ford, Tim Houston are great Canadians. They're my friends. I think when the Conservatives need to grow the tent and win, we've got to make peace with our provincial cousins. Sometimes we will have adverse interests, but you know, our provincial cousins also include Scott Moe. It also includes Danielle Smith, the BC party, which has been in change. So I think, you know, part of it is the provincial scene is changing. Doug Ford is a very different premier than, say, Mike Harris. But that means the federal party has to rebuild those ties, because when the provinces may be in power and strong, the federal government or the federal party often isn't. And our volunteers, our donors, often our staffers are a lot of the same people. So let's make peace. Let's learn. I want to see Pierre get back in the House, because he's very good in the House. So he'll be out of that for a little bit. But there's a lot of positives from this. But I do think overall tone is something I think the leader has to acknowledge himself, but also the whole caucus. I'd like to see caucus do more interviews like this. We've got a lot of smart men and women that step up to serve. They should never skip a debate. They should never skip an appearance to try and give their vision for the country, because the Conservatives had a lot of great ideas on energy, the Arctic, on defense spending, and we shouldn't shy away from them.
And you believe Mr. Poilievre should stay?
Yeah, I think he's earned that right to stay. I think leaders should be given a second chance. You know, won't be applied retroactively to me. I'm fine with that. But there was a lot of great wins, and some of the labor outreach that I started, Pierre continued, and that helped us in Windsor and Hamilton. So I'm very proud of some of those breakthroughs, as he should be. But then you also, like we used to do in the military, after contact, you have an after-action report, what went right, what went wrong, and I think they're going to be doing that.
I'll leave it on that note. Mr. O'Toole, a pleasure. Thanks for coming in. I appreciate it.
Good to see you again.
That's Erin O'Toole, former leader of the Conservative Party.